Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do another little talk using some books and just some commentary. Not very deep commentary, but just a little bit on the Civil War and its endings. Of course, Abraham Lincoln, his image and how it has changed. Also, a lot of things about those that preceded Lincoln and those that followed him and what they went through, their trials and tribulations. Another thing that's kind of fascinating to look at is how people looked at the war afterwards and how they wrote about it and how they prepared things. I have a lot of different stuff from this period. I just pulled out a few things because I'm sure we'll be talking more about this as we go. But I thought it would be fun to share some of the books from my library. I used to have a massive library, and in moving and kind of cutting down in size, I reduced my library by, I'd say, 3/5. And I saved the ones that I really liked and started libraries for a lot of young people. You know, that's a very important thing. A lot of younger people I knew, I wanted to give them books to start their own library, to encourage them to read and study, because that's something that's not pushed hard enough today. And I think that's very important. But enough of that. I am going to pull out some stuff, and some things I have pulled out before in my talk on the Civil War, but I want to illustrate some other things about it. Now, of course, the American Civil War, for all intents and purposes, kind of ends in April of 1865. There will be a few skirmishes for the next month or two. But once Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, it's pretty well established. It's over. Everyone kind of agreed. Lincoln agreed. And also, you got to remember that, Robert E. Lee was writing letters telling people to stop, cease. In fact, if you think about it, once Lincoln is assassinated on April the 14th and dying on the 15th, there is a lot of problems going on. There's a great deal of angst. There's a lot of worry. They're not sure why this is happening. They're not sure if there's a Confederate plot. And Andrew Johnson, who takes over for Lincoln, starts to want to prosecute, people like Lee and whatever. And Grant told him point blank, if you dare do that, I leave. Because Grant was following much of the advice of Lincoln, saying, hey, when this ends, we've got to let him in easy. If you make it difficult. And something, it's a fascinating thing to look at. If you treat your former enemy upon the end of a war very badly, there's a very good chance there's going to be terrible repercussions. Take a look at World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, that's everything that you could ever figure about what not to do at the end of a war. And Lincoln did make sense in that. So I wanted to share a few things here. Of course, once the war ends and Lincoln is dead, the people started to write about him. And very much like Parson Weems with George Washington, if you're familiar with Parson Weems didn't know too much about Washington's early life. So, like any frightening author, he just made it up. That's where our cherry tree story comes from, Parson Weems. Also, he invented the story of Washington at Valley Forge praying in the woods. That's not true at all. Washington had a house. He wasn't going to go in the middle of the woods and go before a Quaker by the name of Potts and pray. Cute story. The whole idea behind it, what Weems was trying to do, was to show the honesty of Washington and the piety of Washington. But it's far better to just tell the truth. And the same thing does happen with Lincoln. After Lincoln's death, he was fair game for lots of people to write books. And the people sometimes didn't know too much about Lincoln. And, to this day, there's lots of things we don't know about Lincoln because Lincoln didn't keep diaries. He was a very closed-mouthed individual about his own personal feelings at times. So it's kind of hard to read Lincoln, and so people who couldn't read him at all created. And there was an entire mess of books that came out that are very good for landfill, to be perfectly honest. There were some good ones I've mentioned before. This one, which is opening up, 6 months in the White House. That was a pretty good book. It's interesting because he talks about things that are going on while he's there and his personal conversations with Lincoln, etc. And of course it was done by Carpenter, who painted that portrait of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which he never learned how to leave alone. He kept working on it and adding to it, and to a degree kind of messing it up. But interesting book. And of course, after Lincoln's death, there's a lot of things going on. And these are kind of interesting pieces. This is the memorial address for Abraham Lincoln this was given before Congress. And here we are. As you will see here. I think I want to... Is that good? I think that covers it pretty well. I'm seeing a kind of a strange reflection here, so let me move this light a little bit. Let's try that again, just to make sure. Yeah, here we have. This was before Congress in 1866. I guess the date was February the 12th, 1866. Now, you have to understand, we had just finished the Civil War, so it took a little while to do a lot of this stuff. So that's why this takes place in 1866. And it was given, of course, by George Bancroft, who also was instrumental in doing things during the funeral program for Lincoln. This is an excellent book. This is the whole funeral program for Lincoln in New York City. Give you the front area here. Let you look at it here. There we are. And this is filled with some wonderful portraits, which I want to share with you, actually. Of course, like any Victorian book of the time, they'll have something like this with, But what they had in here was rather fascinating. I'll show you some of the pictures. Now this is New York City Hall, and it's the movement of the coffin into City Hall. And there's so many interesting pictures made. Pardon me as I slowly get these out here for you. There's only a handful of them, but they are rather fascinating to see. This is the transportation of the funeral car. Across the Hudson River. Another image of the coffin being pulled through New York City. And this is quite a fascinating one. This is the image of Lincoln lying in state in New York City's City Hall. And let's take one more here. I think there's more, but this will be enough. And that's the funeral train, of course. Drawing of it. It's a fascinating book. There's so much information in here. And details. You know, it's interesting, you know, the details of funerals are always kind of fascinating. And also, it's the time, you know, that the end of the war, New York City was not exactly a very welcoming place to Abraham Lincoln during his administration. Fernando Wood had been the mayor of New York City, and he was not exactly fond of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, when Lincoln came to visit one time, came to City Hall itself, and above City Hall was the flagpole, and there was the flag of the United States. And above that was the flag of the city of New York, which wasn't telling Lincoln that he was extremely appreciated. Of course, Lincoln gave his Cooper Union address, had the wonderful opportunity to be in that hall during the memorial service for Arthur Schlesinger, and many, you know, former President Bill Clinton was there, and Henry Kissinger, and a number of other individuals of fascination were there historically. Ted Kennedy was there, and Kennedy's writers, and a mess of other people. I'll have to talk about that some other time. But that's an interesting book when you think about it. You know, Lincoln used to say that New York City was really very important to him in becoming president. He said, because that's where Cooper Union was, and Matthew Brady, who took that famous photograph, which is called the Cooper Union photograph, Lincoln before the beard. And as he was ready to pose for Brady, Brady came over and pulled his collar up a little bit to shorten his neck, just to make the photograph look a little bit better. And that photograph was, you know, spread all over the place, and everybody knew everything about Lincoln. And of course, with Lincoln's funeral, of course, we know it went on, you know, forever. And it's a fascinating story in itself. And maybe I'll do a talk on that eventually. But other people got into the act. And of course, probably, as I've mentioned before, one of the more important books about Lincoln that was probably a little too honest. Although, the one thing I will say is that this book, Herndon's Lincoln, is a little rough on Mary Lincoln. He didn't care too much for Mary Lincoln. And that was true with a lot of people. There was a lot of people who had trouble with Mary Lincoln. But I think it's kind of unfair to Mary Lincoln. This is an interesting set. This is signed by Jesse Wilk, who was the co-author with William Herndon. And of course, this is. I'll just open the one here because it's just difficult to hold all these. This is, of course, the start of this. Herndon's Lincoln, signed by Jesse Wilk. And also, as I mentioned before, these came from the library of Jimmy Durante, who is a famous vaudevillian and entertainer. Many of you will know who that is. And it's kind of nice to have some of Jimmy Durante's books in my library. Let me move these over here. Now, some people tried to reclaim their image a little bit. And one of them was good old James Buchanan. And of course, we know with James Buchanan, he had a hard time. He was a diplomat more than anything else. He was not good at being president. He was far better being a diplomat. And this is, let me open this up. This is a little delicate, this book. Yes. Oops, there we are. Did you see the whole thing there? The very odd thing about this book, it is written by James Buchanan, but you'll notice it says Mr. Buchanan's administration. It's written in the third person, which is kind of strange. He's writing about himself like he wasn't himself, which is very, very strange. It's an interesting book to read, fascinating thing to read about the history of the time, which he gives a great deal of detail and works very hard to redeem himself. But in the end, I would have to say he fails. And it just didn't make any sense doing this in the third person. That was kind of strange. He was followed by Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, was not the politician that Lincoln was. And to be perfectly honest, the only reason he was vice president and they pushed Hannibal Hammond out, his previous vice president, was basically because he was from Tennessee and he stayed with the Union. The reason was he was a stubborn thing, and so the reason he didn't join the South was because when he made up his mind, he just did things that way. He didn't like adding to the Constitution. He didn't like changing things. And of course, when he becomes president on the death of Lincoln, he sticks to that same policy. He tries to follow Lincoln's policy, but he's dealing with the radical Republicans. And he doesn't want to add to the Constitution. He's not very fond of the 14th, or the 13th, or the 15th Amendments. And all hell breaks loose. And of course, as we know, eventually you have the Tenure of Office Act, and that is used to bring about, impeachment against Johnson. And this is the whole set of Johnson's impeachment, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Fascinating reading, somewhat dry, I will admit. Sometimes you find one of these, or sometimes you find two, but very rarely do you get all three of them together. It's really fascinating because the third one is like a follow-up on various issues, which is quite fascinating as well. Put this down here. Now, other people worked hard on talking about the Civil War when it ended. Of course, you know, Harpers Weekly had been the big newspaper during the Civil War. And so in the 1860s through the 1880s, they produced this very heavy set of books called Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War. Of course, you could get your exercise while you're reading this. These things are massive and huge, as you can see. And of course, what's in them is all of the Harpers Weeklies during the Civil War. Let's see if I can show these to you, because it's... Hold on, here we are. This is just big, and I wish I had somebody here, a camera, to work with me. I'm doing this myself, so I'll try to do this delicately so we don't have any. But this is the book, the front piece, and as we go through it, it is just everything, you know, all the images, battles, and the like, you know, from the war. You know, here's Grant receiving his commission as a lieutenant general from Lincoln, you know, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just chock filled. You name the event, it's covered in these. And these were very popular. Work as boat anchors too. And they're really fascinating. I mean, I can spend hours just reading these things because they're truly interesting, and I'm very happy to have a set here. Now, the last thing I want to pull up here is something that's more of a personal nature by someone, I don't know who, but they kept a scrapbook at the end of the Civil War and put all kinds of newspaper articles and events and things into their scrapbook that was all about the Civil War. And take a look at this. This is quite amazing. And this piece here in color, and this thing is chock filled with newspaper clippings from the Civil War. All the way through for the first 20 pages, there's nothing but Civil War news. And this individual, whoever they were, didn't put a name in it, collected all of that, and then they collected newspaper reports going all the way through to the 1880s. And in doing so, they were careful to capture all the obituaries of various individuals in the Civil War. We have Grant's funeral, we have the funeral of many other individuals during the Civil War. Also, the political situations going on. It's just chock full of stuff. And it was all from newspaper accounts. And I'm very thankful to whoever this person was that created this phenomenal book. I breeze through this all the time because every time I go through it, because there's so much, I learn something new. And what they did also is they clipped out old clippings that they had done ages before and left them in here. And there is obituaries for President Harrison in 1841, for Henry Clay, for Daniel Webster. All of the politicians of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s are captured in this scrapbook. I've often thought it would be a fun thing to work with somebody and just make copies of this thing, because a lot of the stuff in here is just not valuable in the sense of a monetary term, but valuable in information sense. And that's true of old books and people like myself who will collect the old books and try to preserve them, because, once again, we have to always remember this, is that we rent them for a while. Because, 20 years from now, I won't be here. And, someone else will have these. And hopefully they will have the same feelings and opinions and wish to rent them for their lives and save them for the next generation. Because that's what we're doing here. And that's what I'm trying to share here. Sharing some of the things that I have learned. And I figured I should mention all this. We often sit there and say, we should do this, and then we finally go the way of the dodo, and we never do it. So that's why I'm trying to share this stuff. So that's pretty much what I wanted to mention here. There's a lot of things within what I showed you that perhaps I may, at another time, dig into further, because especially like the scrapbook here. I've got several scrapbooks. One from the 1860s to the 1880s. I got another one from the 1890s into 1900. And then I have one from the 1920s into the 30s that was kept by my own grandfather. So that's about all I need to say. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you found this interesting. It's always fun to share these things. And when we share things, we share knowledge. And I think that's one of the most greatest gifts we can give to each other. Thank you very much, and have a good day.